Alright, welcome to New Testament Studies. We're going to do your final review, so go ahead and print this out if you need to. Feel free to fast forward and rewind. We're just going to go through it quickly, so pause as needed. Alright, number one, explain how the desire to be published can influence negative behavior in academic research. So by negative behavior, what I'm meaning is the fact that sometimes scholars, in a desire to be published, a desire to be funded, a desire to be successful in their field, will often overlook clear facts or things that they know they probably are bending a little bit, and so one thing that you'll notice is that that where scholars can be very critical of someone's research if it's not theirs, when they're doing their own in attempts to get published, you'll see sometimes that they overlook things that to the casual observer seem like very plain facts, particularly academic scholars that try to put themselves in opposition with biblical truth, right? Because we know that the Bible is true, we know that God's Word is true, and so anytime that a human puts himself in opposition to that, you end up noticing all kinds of errors in their approach, because you can't refute the truth without having to bring in some kind of an error. So I want something to that effect, that that when they try and refute the Bible, often they skip right over things, or they bend, I don't want to say bend the rules, but they relax their standards is probably a good way to say that. An example would be in the New Testament. There are thousands and thousands of copies of New Testament documents, and there's some scholars that then will question the authenticity of the biblical manuscript. But then yet there's only handfuls of other copies of things that they will positively assert, well, clearly that had to have been written by such and such. We've got 4 copies of that. And then you think, man, we've got like 30,000 copies of the New Testament from that time period, and yet there's still people that want to question. So the idea is that anytime you set yourself against the Bible, it ends up resulting in a lot of kind of relaxed academic standards. Okay. Number 2, explain in your own words why the date that a manuscript was written holds major significance. So I want something there to the effect that if a manuscript was written 100 years after the events, that's clearly not as reliable as something that was written 20 years after the events. Or if you start getting to 200 years later, I mean, think about it. 200 years ago, this country was just coming out of the Revolutionary War, and there's nobody alive today that can give eyewitness testimony or anything like that. The only thing that anybody's writing today about the Revolutionary War, they're writing things that were handed down to them, right? They're maybe writing about something that they read about, but it's so far behind us that nobody really, has eyewitness testimony to that. So once you start getting out of that range of eyewitness testimony, then the credibility of the authors goes down a little bit. So maybe not their overall credibility in terms of who they are as an author, but their ability to write about something. If they weren't eyewitnesses, if they weren't able to speak to eyewitnesses, it begins to go down, because then they're just writing about something that they've read and something that they've heard, as opposed to someone who's a little closer, had a chance to talk to people who actually were there. Okay, that's why the Gospels are so important, and the dating of the Gospels is such a hot button issue. So many people want to focus their attack on gospel studies on the dating, because if they can move the dates further out, then they shed a lack of credibility, and they kind of put a little bit of doubt into people's minds about the authenticity of the Gospels. And so that's why it's very important that we kind of show why, and hold fast to our dating. And most of the time the challenges to dating are flimsy. When somebody comes in and says, "Oh, I think the Gospels must have been written later," it's very flimsy scholarship that they use. All right, number 3. Why is it important to note that the canonical Gospels were circulated anonymously? Right. Well, here's the thing. You kind of see that all of the canonical Gospels were circulated somewhat anonymously. Right. Luke being perhaps the exception there, but even in Luke's, he's not calling it the Gospel of Luke. So most of these 4 Gospels were written anonymously and circulated anonymously, and the idea is that the focus was supposed to be on the message itself. But then you start looking at the false Gospels, and in order to gain credibility, you notice all of the false Gospels were circulated under the name of one of the apostles, which kind of hints at the fact that it was a forgery, because the person is using the apostle's name to give it credibility, when the canonical Gospels, the apostles took a different route. They were more concerned with making it about Jesus and about his message than they were about getting their name attached to it. Okay. Number 4, list the 4 false Gospels discussed in class and give a reason for each as to why they are not considered genuine. Okay, so I went through each of these 4. What I'll do is I'll give you the 4, and then you're going to want to go back in and watch that video on false Gospels and get an idea or thought or two for each one. So the first one was the Gospel of Thomas. Right? The second one was the Gospel of Peter. The third one was the Gospel of Mary. And then the fourth one was the secret Gospel of Mark. Okay. Number 5. Give 3 defenses for the authenticity of the text that we have received of the New Testament. All right, so I've talked about a few of these things, so let me give you just a few. I just need 3 for this lesson, but here's a few. We have over 30,000 copies of the Bible in some form from antiquity. Right? That's huge. Number 2, in addition to that, there are over 1 million quotations of the Bible from the early church fathers' writings, right? So somebody living in antiquity who's writing their own book, and they're quoting from the Bible, right? So we've got another 1 million quotations on top of the 30,000 copies of manuscripts that we have. And so those 1 million quotations add a further layer of authenticity to the 30,000 manuscripts, because they're verified in other people's writings from the time. And then another one would be changes from the Greek text to the first millennium, right? Changes of the Greek text of the first millennium, to, like 1,500 years later, were less than like 2%. Right, so all that Middle Ages period where people talk about things being changed is less than 2%, and most of those changes are easily accounted for with just stylistic things. As language changed, they're trying to make things a little easier to read. So that's 3. You could use those 3, and I think that would be good. Okay. Number 6, explain the minimalist facts approach as it regards the study of Jesus' resurrection. Right? So the idea here is that if we can establish some facts that everyone agrees on, that's a good starting point for a discussion about the resurrection. Right? So the idea is that you're trying to look for the facts that are the most attested first, the ones that are the most verifiable, the ones that are the most clear. And so for the Gospels, there were 5, and we'll get to that in another question. But the idea here is that what you're looking at is trying to find things that even skeptics of the resurrection is an agreed upon fact, right? So the minimalist facts approach, and we go through and find 5 things for the study of the Gospels that are minimalist facts that everyone who studies the Gospels agree with. And then when you put those 5 together, then it builds a pretty impressive case for the validity of the Gospels, right? Just from an analytical standpoint, right? We have faith, and that's huge. But just from a purely analytical analysis of the 4 Gospels, these 5 facts that everyone agrees on alone form a very convincing case for the resurrection, right? So let me, for the next question, number 7, is list and describe the 5 minimalist facts. So I will give them to you. I'll give you the 5, but I want you to go in and work on the descriptions yourself. So the first one is Jesus was killed by crucifixion. Okay. So when you're describing them, basically what I'm wanting you to do here is to explain. You could give a description. You could explain how we know that this fact is true. I gave that in class. So just some facts to back these up, right? So Jesus was killed by crucifixion. The second one is that Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them, right? So Jesus' disciples believed that he rose and appeared to them. The third one is Paul's conversion, right? The fourth one is James's conversion, right? Jesus' brother. And then the fifth fact is the empty tomb, right? Okay, so nobody disputes the fact that there's an empty tomb. Not even Jesus' enemies were disputing the fact that there was an empty tomb. They were just trying to explain it in a different way, right? Okay. So, number 8. In 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says that our bodies are sown as natural. In this context, what does natural refer to? So when Paul says our bodies are sown as natural, but they're raised spiritual, that word natural does not mean physical or, like flesh and blood, like to touch. That word natural would best be described when we say something is fleshly, it's carnal, it's sinful, it's not holy, right? So when Paul's saying our bodies are sown natural but they're raised spiritual, he's not saying that we're born that we die with a natural body, but when we're resurrected we won't have a natural body. What he's saying is that what is dying is a carnal body, a sinful body. What's being raised is a spiritual body, right? Okay, so it's not a description between a body that can be touched like flesh and blood versus a body that is only mystical and spiritual and perhaps invisible. What he's saying is it's the difference between a body that is that dies, that was filled with sin, versus the body that rises is spiritual in nature and it doesn't have the sin that we had when we went to the grave, right? All right. Number 9, describe the main rebuttal to the skeptic's accusation that the body of Jesus was simply moved. So this goes back to one of the 5 minimalist facts, was that there was an empty tomb, right? And so the idea is that the Pharisees try to say that the reason that the tomb is empty is because the body was just moved, right? So the main rebuttal to that is that the disciples were willing to lay down their life for what they believed. And the main thing that they said they believed that caused them to be willing to lay down their life, right, was that they saw him after he was killed, right? And so it is their eyewitness testimony to his resurrection, right, that was the foundation of their future proclamation, right? And so the main defense here then is that the disciples were saying the reason they believed is because they saw him after his crucifixion, and then they were willing to die for that statement, to say that they still believe it. They know they saw him being raised from the dead. They know they saw him after his crucifixion. And so, as the old saying goes, liars, untruthful people don't stand up under judgment would be a good way to say that. Liars make poor martyrs. That when somebody's nailing you to a cross or whipping your flesh, if you are lying about it, and all you have to do is just admit you were lying, and then you can get away from the pain, you can start over fresh, they'll let you go back to your family, and all you have to do is just say, alright, I give up on the lie. But that never happened for any of the disciples. None of them. They all maintained that their story was that they saw Jesus rise from the dead. And that's a huge fact, right, that's out there. That the disciples say they saw it, and they were willing to die for it, and not a single one of them ever refuted what he said, even though all of them were tortured in some way. All of them were beaten and then eventually killed, and none of them ever said that what they saw was not true. And that's huge. That's very strong. Knowing human nature, that is very strong. Alright. Number 10. What foundational belief is necessary for the correct exegesis of the four Gospels? So this one I repeated a lot in the last few videos, and that is that you need the foundation of belief that the Gospels are historical, and that they are intended to accurately record historical events. Right? Okay. That they are intended to accurately record historical events. Okay. Number 11. What does it mean that ancient biographies tended to show the life of their main character? So what I'm after here is something that explains the fact that the narrator's comments were minimal, right? It wasn't the narrator taking front and center stage and just describing some things that happened. The narrator takes a back seat, and the life of the person that they're trying to emphasize takes a front seat, and so they are showing the story of Jesus, not so much telling it from a narrator's point of view, but they are taking a back seat as the narrator, only putting in small little details where necessary, but trying for the most part to let the story speak for itself. Right? Number 12, give 3 supporting ideas that defend Markan priority. Right? So we did quite a bit on this under the video of the 2 videos for source criticism. Right? So a couple of things. Mark is shorter. It's a lot easier to explain someone like Matthew and Luke wanting to expand than it is to understand why Mark would want to write a new gospel that was just an abbreviated version of one that somebody already had. Luke and Matthew rarely change the order of Mark, right? And where they do, there's no places that Matthew and Luke agree, right? So if there's a place that Matthew and Luke are not following Mark word for word, in those places Matthew and Luke are very different. So it shows you that the common denominator is Mark, right? So it's not like Matthew and Luke were commonly written and then Mark came along later, because the places where they don't follow Mark word for word, Matthew and Luke are not the same. And so it goes to show that Matthew and Luke were not written together and then Mark looked at them. It appears the other way around, right? And then another one would be Mark's writing style is less sophisticated, right? It'd be really hard to explain why, if Mark came second, why he would dumb down the writing style. If all he's doing is copying from Matthew and Luke, you think he just copied it. It's hard to explain why, if he was copying Matthew and Luke, why he would change their good writing style into his. It's a lot easier to explain how when they redid his, they decided to fix some of the grammatical kind of and stylistic issues. Alright, so that's a few there. The Q hypothesis, also known as the two-document hypothesis. So I'll give you a few. The material not in Mark, right, that's common to both Luke and Matthew, has similarities, right? So it's not word for word, right? But there are similarities, which shows that they're not exactly like Mark. And in some of the places where they are similar, it's kind of a little too similar to easily explain away, right? And so the idea is that the Mark part was that we're in a story that Mark gives, that Matthew and Luke give, but they don't follow Mark's order. Matthew and Luke are not the same, right? So that first part, when I was doing with number 12, were areas where Mark tells a story, Matthew and Luke also tell the story, but they don't follow Mark's order, right? In those areas, Matthew and Luke do not agree, right? But there are some areas in places that they're using a story that Mark doesn't use at all, right? So it's not in Mark at all, and Matthew and Luke are using the story. Well, Matthew and Luke in those places are often very similar, right? And so then the idea is that there very well could have been then another document similar to Mark that Matthew and Luke were both using as a foundational kind of launching point for theirs, right? There are some sayings that appear to be repeated within the same gospel, right? Which is strange. So there's actual quotes that you find at the beginning of a gospel and then somewhere, towards the middle or end of the gospel, but it's the same line in two different places. So that makes it seem like they had, say, copied some from Mark and some from the second document, and both Mark and the second document had used that quotation of Jesus, right? And then let me give you one other one here. That here's another. The order of the material. So not just the wording, but sometimes the order. So the three that we'll give you is the wording in things not common in Mark is often word for word in some places. Similarly to that, the order of things, of stories, that's not found in Mark, but is found in Matthew and Luke, can be very similar, right? So the wording is one thing. So we're looking at exact phrases are found in one that are also found in the other. And then the order of stories in some places is exactly the same, right? So they go from this parable to that parable to this story to that parable and back to that parable. So Matthew and Luke tell two or three things together that are similar in both spots, right? And then kind of that third one is the repeated sayings, right? So that it's found in the beginning and at the end. So either Jesus said the exact same thing twice, or they used two different documents that had the same quote from Jesus in them as their foundation for their document, right? All right. Number 14, list and define. And if that was confusing to you then, because sometimes that's a little easier understood with a fuller explanation, feel free to go back in there and watch over that video. Number 14, list and define the four types of gospel criticism covered in class. All right, so let me show you 14 and 15. They're very similarly worded, but I'm after different things here. Okay, so 14 says list and define the four types of gospel criticism. All right, so for this one, I just want you to list them and then give me a basic definition for each one. Okay. In 15, I want you to list the four types of gospel criticism covered in class and give both the positive application and the potential negative application, right? So if you remember, for each one of these in the video, I give you an example of how I think it should be applied, right? And I give you an example of how it is applied in a bad way that kind of leads you away from the truth, right? So for each one of these, I gave a positive and a negative. So that's what I want in 15. I want you to go back in, look at these four types, and give me a positive way to use. So we'll take source criticism for an example. I want a positive way that you can use source criticism for good biblical research. And then I want you to give me an example of how people use source criticism in a negative way to cause people to doubt the authenticity of the Gospels, right? Okay, so that's 15. And then in 14, I just want the list and the definition, right? So I'll give you the 4. It's very simple. There's a video basically for each one. You got source criticism, you have form criticism, you have redaction criticism, and you have literary criticism. So those are the 4. So I want you to, in question 14, you're going to give those 4 in a brief definition of what they are. And then in 15, I want you to give those same 4, but then give me the positive application and then the negative kind of warning about how they can be used in the wrong way. Okay? If you have any questions over this, give me an email. You should have no problem. If you do, go back first, check out your videos, and you should have no problem with this one.